Hello everyone, my name's Emma Aston. I'm a historian of ancient Greece working at the University of Reading, and in this short talk I'm going to be talking to you about food for gods and humans, and that is to say the consumption of the carcasses of animals sacrificed in a ritual fashion to gods and goddesses in ancient Greece. If we walk around any museum with a collection of antiquities, for example, the Museum of Greek Archaeology, we find ourselves surrounded by wonderful images of animals of many different species on all sorts of objects. So here we've got a rather lovely black figure pot, a shallow dish from central Greece, from Boeotia, showing a number of different animal species in a sort of circular parade. But we have sculptures of animals, of course, in relief and in the round, many other different kinds of artifacts as well. Why were animals such a popular source of inspiration to ancient artists? Well, their value took many forms. They were prized for their aesthetic qualities. Horses in particular seem to be a subject of almost fascination, you might say, for artists and viewers in their elegance and speed and other qualities. They might have symbolic value. They might be a way of thinking about distant and exotic lands. The panther on this lecanis is not a type of animal that the Greeks would experience in their own daily lives on a routine basis, so it might be a way of thinking about the exotic and places where the exotic creatures dwell. Of course, animals have a role in myth. They can be ferocious and exciting opponents of the hero Heracles, for example, the Nemean lion being the most famous one of those. So there are many different reasons for their popularity in Greek art. But one key source of their social value is that they are gifts for the gods. Giving an animal to a god almost always consists of ending its life, normally at an altar, surrounded by ritual and ceremonial, which I'm going to go on to talk about. Just a couple more images from the museum. Here's a rather lovely ram's head right on. It's a drinking vessel, but as you can see, it takes a very unusual form. The ram's head is actually upside down there, allowing it to rest on its lip, but you can see the handle there, allowing it to be raised to the mouth of the drinker. That's a bit later than the foregoing image, 4th century BC, so early Hellenistic period. A ram would have been and indeed sheep generally would have been a sort of mid-range sacrificial animal. The most prized and the most valuable sacrificial victims would have been the bovines, bulls, cows, oxen, sheep somewhere in the middle of the sort of economic range, and then poultry would provide some of the cheaper, the more affordable victims, and we'll come on to this issue of sort of scarcity and supply later on. Sacrifice is almost certainly being alluded to in this sweet little terracotta figurine. We may think, coming at it from a modern perspective, that the person depicted here is holding a pet, a cherished companion animal, but actually pets in our sense of the word are relatively rare. In ancient Greece, it's a relatively infrequent reason to have an animal, that sense of wanting to strike up an emotional bond with it. Instead, I'm afraid what we probably have here is a representation of somebody preparing to sacrifice some small quadruped to a deity. We can't be absolutely sure, of course, but based on the ancient evidence we have, that seems most likely. And this object may have been dedicated in a sanctuary as a sort of souvenir or commemoration of an act of sacrifice which took place on the same site. Sacrifice is in itself a theme of depiction in ancient art, frequently because of its enormous centrality and importance in Greek society. What we tend to find in images on painted pottery is that the act of killing the animal itself, that moment of taking its life, is avoided. After all, it would have been a moment full of movement and drama and upset and noise and a certain amount of disorder, however carefully controlled the sacrifice was. So instead, vase painters avoid that and prefer the preparation for sacrifice and the phase that immediately followed it. So here we have a preparatory scene. We have women decking with garlands, a couple of sacrificial bulls, really beautifully drawn. I mean, look at the detail of the animal's skin, the sort of folds of skin around the neck, the beautiful delineation of the eyes and the ears and horns. This object is in London's British Museum, as you can see, and it's from the mid-400s, mid-5th century BCE. So preparatory scenes showing the animals being made particularly beautiful, being made ready for their deaths, in effect, are popular. And then the other type of sacrificial scene which is popular is what follows the killing, which is the preparation of the meat of sacrifice for consumption by humans and by gods alike. I know that you have the opportunity to watch in this series a short film my colleague Amy Smith made about libations, offerings of fluid of various sorts, and you can see a libation being conducted by the person on the left-hand side of the altar in the middle of this scene. He's holding a vessel and he's about to pour fluid onto the sacrificial fire on the altar. On the right of the altar is somebody holding some of the sacrificial meat on a long spit and preparing it for consumption. So preparation for sacrifice and the preparation for the meal afterwards are the two phases of the whole drama that vase painters in particular like to depict. Well, if sacrifice turns up often depicted in art, that's, I think, nothing compared to its frequency and centrality in ancient Greek literature, and this starts with Homer. I've chosen here one passage from many in the two poems attributed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which deal with sacrifice in great detail, and the way in which the narrative slows down to really lavish detail on the sort of practical and ceremonial aspects of sacrifice is really significant, I think, and tells us a lot about its importance in the society that Homer is wishing to represent. Here we have a passage from Book 3 of the Odyssey, in which the young man Telemachus, Odysseus' son, is receiving hospitality. He's a guest in the household of Nestor and Nestor's family. And they, as a good host, Nestor provides him with a lavish meal, but that meal is preceded by a sacrifice, because the consumption of meat in ancient Greece almost always was preceded by a sacrifice. It's not quite the case that every single meal of meat would have been sacrificed in ancient Greece. There are some circumstances in which the Greeks did eat meat without first dedicating it to the gods, but that was very rare. For the most part, if you have a meal with meat in it, that meat would have come from a sacrificed animal. And so there's this indissoluble bond between lavish feasting and this religious act, first dedicating the animal to the gods before the humans get their share. So I'm going to show you two contiguous passages of this episode in Book 3 of the Odyssey, and this first one that you see on the screen here has the preliminaries. And just as the vase painters love to show the preparation of the sacrificial victim, so does Homer. You can see we have, first of all, the gathering of the human participants. Well, and the animal, indeed, the cow arrives, not of her own volition, it has to be said. The humans turn up, including Telemachus. We have a craftsman, the smith, who turns up, and we'll see what he does in a moment. And then, interestingly, the goddess Athena actually arrives in person at this sacrifice. And we have to remember that in the Odyssey, we're dealing with the lives of heroes, demigods, who are in close relationship with gods and goddesses in a way that the real Greeks of the historical period were not. This is a fantasy text in some ways. However, that sense that the deity actually participates in the sacrifice is not unrealistic. The Greeks certainly thought that when they sacrificed, the deity they were aiming at, so to speak, was able to take part in it and absorb the smoke of the sacrifice and also be pleased by the honour done them. Okay, so next in this passage we have the gilding of the horns of the cow to make it extra beautiful. This isn't just an aesthetic act, but the value of the gold adds to the value of the offering, and we're told that the goddess, and it is Athena, was gloriously glad at the sight. So the importance of choosing a really good sacrificial victim and then making it as beautiful and as valuable as possible is emphasized here. And then we have the run up to the actual act of killing, various preparations. We have water brought for washing, acts of purification, ritual purification in advance of the killing, very important. The scattering of barley grains we have, and a bowl to catch the blood that results from the blow. A prayer to Athena, a ceremonial snipping of hairs from the cow's head and burning of those hairs. And then, unlike our vase painter, Homer is happy to depict the killing itself. So in this passage, we have the cutting of the tendons of the cow's neck to immobilize it, and the cutting of the throat comes a few lines later. In between those two acts, we have something called the ololuge, a ritual cry uttered by the women of the household. Interestingly, that is an important role that they fulfill. The killing is not done by women, but they add to the ceremonial surrounds by giving this cry. It's translated as they ululated, but the Greek word, the Greek noun for this cry is an ololuge. We have the flowing out of the blood, and then we have the ritual butchery, the cutting up of the carcass, which is the absolute crux of the whole event because it's the preliminary to the meal. And you'll see that the cutting up of the flesh is really not haphazard. It's very careful, and it follows, if you read more and more of these sacrificial descriptions in ancient texts, you'll see that there's a lot of resemblance between them. There is a certain way in which you butcher a sacrificial carcass. You don't just do it any old how. So the cutting out of the thighs and the covering them with fat, and also the wrapping of entrails on spits, and the roasting of these entrails over the fire. So really, really careful, traditional, conventional forms of butchery, after which certain parts of the carcass are eaten by the human participants, while others are burnt so that the gods may themselves participate in the feast. Now, the kind of sacrifice we find in Homer conducted by heroes like Nestor is not, of course, the sort of sacrifice that, quote unquote, normal Greeks would conduct in their own households. We would expect much, much less lavish equipment and materials, and a much more modest and humble sacrificial victim, as I say, something like poultry, for example. But when we do see the sacrificial killing of bovines, it's often done on the level of a whole community, a polis, a city-state coming together with state finance behind the occasion, and coming together in an act of collective ceremonial to worship the gods as a community rather than by individual households. So the sacrifice of large, expensive quadrupeds is not unknown, but tends to be done on the civic rather than the private basis. We have to remember that it is the nature of the Greek landscape in most parts of Greece that it isn't particularly conducive to the rearing of animals in large numbers. On the whole, the Greek landscape lends itself to a model of small mixed farming, in which small numbers of animals are reared alongside the production of crops of different sorts. It is an inefficient use of scarce land resources to commit large tracts of land to pastoralism, specialist pastoralism. And so animals, particularly bovines with large alimentary needs, are in relatively short supply. They're expensive. If you do own a bovine as a normal Greek, it's probably going to be a plough ox, and you're not going to want to kill it even for a god or goddess, because it needs to pull your plough. It's useful to you alive. It may be delicious if you kill it, but then it's gone. You don't have it anymore. So the Greek diet on a day-by-day basis is extremely meat light. Mostly vegetables, pulses, and dairy products are the norm in dietary terms. Eating meat and eating milk, I beg your pardon, milk products like cheese allows you to get animal protein without the animal losing its life and becoming thereafter unavailable to you. So cheese is very important. Meat is a rarity and therefore, of course, it's a treat. A lot of excitement attends the sort of lavish consumption that follows an animal sacrifice. So we have this bundle of really important elements within the social fabric of ancient Greece. We have pleasing the gods, communicating with the gods, finding a way of bridging the gap between humans and gods. But then we also have this rare opportunity for humans to eat meat, and the need to do so in a ceremonially controlled environment.